Hello everyone, it's me Uncle John. Today I am going to read at 6100 Gazing at Stars, A Dream of China of Vidya Yu. He was a grey old man in old one cloth, and he spoke with the crossness of one who has known for years that he is unlucky in life. Could I get him out of China? He asked. I thought of my mother, little fat, my husband and baby. I couldn't imagine the man sleeping on out our Italian leather sofa. I want to see your father again, the gray old man unwisely said, then decided the matter. I did not want him to see my father again. If I had anything to do with it, he'd never see my father again. The sad, dishonest eyes lost the watery hold they had gained on my sympathy. My mind stopped wondering whether an extra bed could be fitted and began to search for a polite way to say no. My father is a good man. My mother, his second wife, died soon after I was born, and my father retired in order to have the time to bring me up. Until then, he had been scientist at the University of Singapore. He still produced on occasion a scientific article, in between teaching me the right way to hold the Chinese writing brush and telling me stories. As I grew up and he grew older, his stories were more and more often about China. China was the most beautiful of all a beautiful country where he has spent his youth. After 50 years in Singapore, home for him was still Sichuan in southwest China. My elder sisters and brother, all children of his first marriage and many years older than me, want me. Whenever he sees anything particularly beautiful, he says, "That's how it is in China. You mustn't believe all of it, you know." They were sorry for me, a child living with an old man who told the same stories over and over again. But children love repetition and began to dreams of China too. I, who was born countless miles from China, on this island of Singapore, I dreamed of the strange mountains and calm waters. I dreamed of the magic creatures. In China, there were spirits in the trees and the animals. All this was much more interesting than the Western stories of magic, where there were all colorful pictures of white people with wings. More interesting too than daily life in Singapore. Here, the closest thing to magic was the primary school toilet, where a ghost was supposed to live. But there was one thing about China that made my father feel extremely guilty. Because of that, he had decided that he would die in exile, never to return. After the Second World War, when the Japanese gave up Singapore and left China, my father and his younger brother had a choice. They could stay in Singapore or they could return to build a new China. In their youth, and they were still young then, the brothers had believed in the revolution. Against their father's wishes, both had left home to join the army, which was fighting to bring new life to the rotten, dying nation they loved. At home, they had seen China through the eyes of the fortunate as the sons of a wealthy man. In the army, and disinherited by their father, they saw their country differently, wild and bruised, but still beautiful. It is hard to understand the appeal of a beautiful and suffering country, but it existed in China then. At the time, my father had a steady income from teaching in Singapore. He had his wife and my eldest sister, who was already born. He chose to stay in Singapore. It was this decision that, in later years, he considered his most cowardly act. His younger brother returned to China to help rebuild the country after the war. My father remained in Singapore. He missed China very much. He saw his act of selfishness reflected in the shallowness of the lives his university students led. All they did was study. If they did dream, it was of having a reliable job and owning a car. Most of his students were Chinese, but they did not have the determination they should have. The determination which his younger brother had, and he laughed. My elder sisters and brother laughed at him. Young Singaporeans are practical. My third sister used to say, "Do you want them to start a revolution when they don't see anything wrong with this country?" And my brother would ask, What do you think is wrong with Singapore? My father could see only one thing wrong with Singapore. But that one thing counted far for more than anything else. Singapore was not China. He had failed to return to China as his brother had. His younger brother had done right, and he had done wrong. He was too overcome by shame to return later when he was older. But lots of people go around China on the tours. My brother tried to persuade him. They have special tour just for old people. They're always talking about going back. Why don't you go now? You may not have many years left, you know. I'll pay for the trip, of course. There's a tour group leaving in the second week of June. Why don't you let me get your place on that one? My brother is not easy to resist, but my father resisted him. He felt he did not deserve to see China again. Although he wanted to very much, instead he wrote poems in Chinese about living in exile, and he tried to live as he felt the true Chinese would. He was westernized to a certain extent and did not demand unquestioning obedience from his children. Being Chinese for him meant remaining calm at all times, respecting the servant's feelings, and never thinking about financial gain. My father sympathized with his second daughter's son, whose name was Golden Dragon. The boy was trying to find out more about his father's family, his identity as a human being. Without the experience of your ancestors before you, it is hard to build a strong future. My father said to Golden Dragon. We knew he was thinking not only of his grandson, but of his children, who had never seen the graves of the ancestors in Sichuan. The years passed. I discovered that not everyone viewed China as my father did. The Red Guard took over all of China, and Chinese people living overseas sent money, woolen clothes, and pity to those left behind. This made my father feel even worse, as he lived in comfort away from his country instead of suffering with her. I learned more about my father's feelings after I married. He told my husband, whose name was Heavenly Wisdom, things he felt a girl should not hear. My husband was not so sensitive, passed them on to me. Was not only ashamed for ignoring the call of his country that had kept my father from China all these years. Heavenly Wisdom said there was also the letter which his brother had written to him, and my father had reconsidered and spoken of returning to China only months after his brother. Heavenly Wisdom guessed that the younger brother had taken over the dead father's house and the remaining wealth of the family. If my father returned, all would have to be given up to him, as he was the elder son. The letter said my father should not return if he cared about the family at all. He had married without the parents' agreement, and his wife was used to city life in Singapore. Would his wife miss Singapore and want to return, causing the lands to be sold to support her in luxury? My father could not say no with certainty. He felt shame that his younger brother was wiser than him in such matters. He decided not to display such a dutiful son by returning himself. I did know he had meant to go back to China, I said to my husband. Surprise, he never told me that. That was in 1946, long before your time, Heavenly Wisdom said. Absently, anyway, after the Red Guards took over, there was no question of going back. He didn't go back just because of a letter from his brother. I would have gone back anyway and claimed everything that was mine by right. Living in China under the Red Guards would have been no joke. It's a good thing your father didn't go back. But he could have gone back to China and taken everything and come back to Singapore. Then he would be rich as well as free, I agreed. Argued. My husband shook his head mildly. If he had gone back to China, he would have never have left again. Baby one is eating my black socks. He always referred to our sons as baby one and baby two. When they ate socks and other things, he watched them with a scientific interest, but did nothing to prevent them. For the reason in the early years of our marriage, I had little time to think about my father and his brother in China. My father did not allow age to weaken his health or cut down his activity after I married. He moved to a place called Pasir Ris, where he spent his days looking after his plants, writing poems about exile, drinking tiger bone wine. He had never given up his interest in Chinese writing. Often my husband and I took the babies on the long drive up to Pasir Ris, where their grandfather taught the little hands to hold the Chinese brush in the correct way and told them stories about China. Sometimes my father and my husband walked along the beach barefoot, playing a scientific game which involved identifying sea creatures and giving their scientific name. As these were a serious scientific expedition, the babies and I were never allowed to go with them, and it was during one of the expeditions that I discovered some of my father's poems while cleaning his study room. My father never minded me reading his poem. I found my favorite one. Lovely silent carp circling my ornamental pond. Like a wise dove, is all water your element. Do you dream of wide brimming rivers, as I have a dream of home? Surely my father was content in Singapore after all these years, but it was still an ornamental pond and not the wide brimming river, not home. My father's writing made me miss China I had never known. Now, that was beautiful poetry. It stirred up your feelings as well as pleasing the ear and the eye. At the back of the book of poems, there was a packet of letters I hadn't seen before. They were all from the wife of my father's younger brother. They were all letters asking for money to be sent. Did you send them money? I asked my father when he and my husband returned. Yes, I believe I did. He said he took the letters from me and looked at them, vaguely puzzled. More money than he should have. It's a good thing. I'm not the sort of man to marry for wealth. My husband said cheerfully. I could tell he had won the scientific game that day. I wouldn't have given my daughter away to such a man, my father replied, pretending to be very proud. But why would they always asking for money after all? My uncle returned to build a new China. Don't they treat him well there? Why does my uncle's wife write instead of him writing to you himself? One of my babies began to cry for me. Heavenly wisdom went off to pick him up, and through the doorway, I saw him trying to discover where the babies ate grass. My babies did not, and they both began to cry very loudly. For that reason, I did not hear my father's reply. Father didn't seem to want to discuss the matter again after that, and I was left to wonder. Then I was offered a chance to go to China. It was a tour for university students. Young Singaporeans could read and write beautifully correct Chinese, but were awkward when it came to conversation. I was invited to go on the tour because my spoken Chinese was so good. Because it was thought I knew something about China. Being my father's daughter, it was my opportunity at last to see the land of my people. I wanted to go on the tour very much, but it was not my place to say anything. So I waited, trying to look patient, as my husband thought about it. He did not have much enthusiasm for China. His parents had never spoken to him of China, except of their relief to have left in time. To him, the old China had been a country of rottenness and suffering, where whole families starved to death and daughters were sold. The China had only slightly more appeal for him. I did not expect him to give permission for me to leave him and the babies for such a trip. You may go if you wish, he said in the end. They only pay half the expenses, so you will have to pay the other half, I reminded him. Do you doubt that I can do that? So it was agreed. I went to China for 2 weeks. It is not my intention to describe China. I'm writing of my family. My father and his younger brother. Something I had set myself to achieve in China was to visit my father's hometown. Here, my uncle and his wife still lived. There were 5 other relations left alive. The tour brought us within 2 hours of my destination. Apparently, 2 hours travel is a huge distance to most people in China, but they often calculated distance by bicycle rather than by car. However, I was able to rent a car, and 2 students and a guide came with me as we traveled through farmland and small towns. I could not imagine my father there. True, there was much beauty in China. On a boat trip the day before, we had all been amazed by the breathtaking loveliness of the river, nearby mountains with their caves of ice, and distant hills dreamy and purple in their vagueness. It seemed a journey back through time into an age of timelessness. But seeing the Chinese people, I felt glad I was a tourist. China spoke to my mind. The idea that this country was where my ancestors came from warmed and stirred me. However, China had nothing to say to my spirit. My spirit felt as foreign here as I did, and only really felt that at home in a city full of purpose and enterprise, shining like a diamond in the modern world. That was where I truly belong, among grass fronted office blocks reaching to the sky. And I finally met my uncle. I felt like a visitor to a strange country, not a returning exile. I saw he had the face of my father. He was thin, with skin like old leather. He spat noisily. When I asked if he had any message for my father, he said, "Tell him to send money." I stayed to have dinner with my aunt and uncle, while the students and guide ate at the foreigners only hotel where we were going to spend the night. I tried to remember everything I could. My father would take delight in every detail I could give him. There were just 2 rooms with black and white photos and a few books. The food was simple and well prepared. All through the meal, my uncle swore continuously at his wife and at my father. My father must have known it would come to this, he said. That was why he had not returned. He had always been the clever one. Why had my father not warned him? He had let his brother walk right into it. My father had only given him a world of money. He would now be in Singapore living in luxury, not being miserable and badly treated in this hole, married to this miserable wife who deserved to be dead. I felt sorry for him. After all, he had the face of my father. I thought of my father, calm and happy in his garden, making scientific notes in his study room, and was thankful that circumstances had kept him away from China. Surely my father sent him money, I asked. Knowing that he did, my uncle replied loudly that he had never asked for any. Then he firmly denied getting any money from my father. And finally, he claimed he didn't get enough money from my father. During this confusing reply, my aunt softly said, "Yes, your father sends money. He is too good to us. Your uncle knows, but would not admit it. Too proud." I did not try any further remarks. My aunt nervously urged me to take more food, while my uncle continued his muttered swearing and self-pity. I gave my uncle the money my father had given me for him and a cassette recorder and camera. My uncle complained because my father had not remembered to send cigarettes because only 1 roll of film came with the camera. What good would the camera be to him after that? He could not afford more film for himself. Surely I could see that. But my aunt asked me to thank my father. They might sell the camera, she said. It would have kept them going well for some time, as my uncle stood there, inspecting the camera and tape recorder, and complaining under his breath. My aunt and I washed the dinner bowls together. "You got some of my relations into trouble," she told me in a low voice. "Now my family won't have anything to do with us, neither will his family. I don't blame them. He betrayed his own cousin on his mother's side. The village children about names at him, and their parents encouraged them. He will not work. He will not even ask for money. I have to do that," she sighed softly. The hair falling untidily onto her face was a yellow white. "My father always sends money when I ask for it. Always a little more than I ask for. He's a good man." "Yes," I agreed. We talked quietly about different relations and what they were doing, so my uncle announced he was going to walk me to the hotel. I bowed goodbye to my aunt. She told me to give the thanks and best wishes to my family, especially my father. The October night was cold. There were yellow pools of streetlight with great areas of darkness between them. We walked from pole to pole in silence. Finally, we reached the hotel. "We'll leave early tomorrow," I said awkwardly. "I suppose I won't see you again on this visit." The man who was my father's brother looked hungrily past me at the gate of the hotel gardens. "The only time we get to go inside is if a foreigner invites us in as guests," he said pointedly. "There is a bar where you can buy me a drink. It's been years since I was invited to have a drink here. Why don't you come in for a drink?" I felt obliged to say. He accepted with childlike excitement, breathing hard in his eagerness. As I held the gate open, and the gatekeeper waved us both in, without checking identification, with great grandness, my uncle ordered orange drinks. From the waiter, he criticized the glasses as dirty when the drinks arrived, and insisted on new one. To this man, my father had trusted the good name of his family. A family now far apart and in disharmony. Could my father live with that? I wondered. One thing that had calmed his spirit in the long years of exile was the thought that he had done right in leaving everything to his brother, who was a better person than he was. I stared at the man swallowing flat orange juice and felt the growing dislike. My father had made a mistake there, but this man had done me a great service by his greed. He had kept my father in Singapore. For that, I owed him a lot. Finally, he let me walk him back to the gate. Just inside the wall, he turned and looked, took one of my hands in both of his, and cried. Tears dropped off his chin. I didn't know what to say, wishing with all my heart I hadn't come to China, and not stirred up such feelings in this miserable failure of a man. When he calmed down, I said, "We'll send you things from Singapore. Can you get me out of China?" he asked. "I want to come back to Singapore. Just me, one person, no wife." Where would he live in Singapore? Not with my father. There was a little room in Pasir Ris. There was a little room in our flat too. He couldn't sleep on the sofa. And what about his wife, alone in China? "I want to see your father again," the man said. An angry, a cheated look had come back into his eye. He obviously felt that my father owed him a lot. No, I wouldn't do this to my father. I wanted to return to Singapore to tell him my uncle was well in China, that he was too busy to write himself. My father could not breathe easily, believe he had done a good thing, and enjoy in his old age the benefits of the good life he had lived and the children he had brought up. This man must not be allowed to come and spoil everything. "Don't leave me to die here. I have not long to live. I want to get out. Can you get me out?" "We'll talk of getting you out when my father has left this world." I said I would never tell my father about this. He understood. He thanked me and walked away, weighed down by hopelessness and his bad nature. I watched him through the gate, a gray old man in old worn clothes, wandering from pole to pole of yellow light. Was as though he was the spirit of China, now broken and leaving me forever. because I could tell he wouldn't outlive my father. If his wife died, I promised myself I would take care of her. My father's China no longer exists, except in him and in other men who try to live true to the dream of China in their hearts. I returned to Singapore, feeling no connection with the China I saw, but no less eager to listen to my father's stories of the most beautiful of all beautiful lands. A country is only as good as its men. My father is a good man, whichever country you can claim as its own. The end.